I want to talk here about the clean slate design model or idealized design. This model is inspired by the work of Russell Ackoff, who used to be a faculty member at the Wharton School for many, many years. I worked with him for a number of years. He passed away a few years ago. The clean slate approach as presented here is my own adaptation of Russell's work on idealized design. So the key element of that approach is the so-called idealized design or redesign of a system. And an idealized design is the best system that we can think of to replace the existing system right away if we were free to do so. So think of the system as being your organization. What would be the best design that you could think of to replace what you currently have if you were free to do so? Now, in order to for this redesign or this design to have to not just be speculation and science fiction, we have to put some conditions on it, and I will talk about them in a minute. But the purpose of the exercise is to shift the perspective from looking back and thinking about what deficiencies and or problems of the past we need to correct towards a prospective orientation focused on what we would really like to have in the future, what is desired, as opposed to what we need to correct. And the second element is because it removes a lot of constraints, it intends to induce more creativity in design. And finally, because we're looking at what might be, it expands our concept of what is feasible. In other words, once you've sort of gone into the world of the best you can think of, things that might have seemed not doable might become, in fact, more feasible, at least in the mindset. So what are the key attributes? There, obviously there has to be a few constraints. The first one is that the design should be technologically feasible. In other words, using only technologies known to be feasible at the time that we are producing the design. Second, it must be operationally viable, meaning that if you were to create it, to make it happen, it would be capable of operating within its current environment. So for example, it means for an organization that it has to be cash flow positive, because if you're cash flow negative, if you lose money every day, you cannot survive. So it does not mean that it's doable, but if it was done, it would survive. And then the third point is that it should be capable of learning and adapting, because for the very simple reason that any design incorporates assumptions about the future, and some of the assumptions may be wrong or may be incomplete, and therefore the design should be capable of modifying itself so that it can actually survive. So, however, and that's the important consideration, is that we should not think about the feasibility of the idealized system other than having those three constraints. Later on, we will look at whether in fact there are elements that can be feasible, but the first step is, given those very, very broad constraints, technologically feasible, operationally viable, and capable of learning and adapting, it's a blank slate, it's a clean slate. We start with nothing to constrain us except for those very, very, very broad consideration 1, 2, and 3 here. So in some sense, what we're trying to do is to leap out from the present to an ideal future and work backwards to see what minimal changes do we need to do from the ideal to make it in fact feasible. And the illustration here shows you that if you go from the present into the future and you plan around the existing constraints, you fall short maybe of where you could be. And whereas when you go into the ideal and come back, you might get to a higher, more desirable position. So the difference between the two, between the arrow on the right and the arrow on the left, that gap, represent the value that the clean slate approach, the idealized design approach, can bring to the organization. So in practice, how do we go about it? Well, here are sort of 8 simple steps or to describe how to go about it. Step number 1 is to define the unit of analysis and scope and assumptions. So what are the boundaries of the system to be designed or redesigned? If you're doing it for your organization, the boundaries are your organization. And what is a larger system within which it operates and which is not being changed? Well, if you are an independent organization, it's obviously the socioeconomic context in which you operate, which is a given. If you are a branch of a national organization, then you have to take the national organization as a given, and what you're changing is within your own branch. So what comes as policies and rules from the national organization are given, etc. So you have to define those boundaries. And are there other assumptions or constraints that will apply to the redesigned system? So, for example, you have maybe some laws, some regulations that apply, or whatever. So that's step 1. In other words, step 1 defines, to use the language of another of the playing to win model, to define a little bit of the playing field here. Step 2, you want to identify the mission or missions of the redesigned system. In other words, once you have redesigned your system, what do you want that system or that organization to be able to accomplish? So what should be the mission, and what are specific directions and targets to be pursued? And here we want things that are as specific as possible. There are some examples on the slide here, but you want, again, to stay away from motherhood and an apple pie type of statement, but things that are more specific, almost akin to what I've defined as a SMART goal in one of the other PowerPoints. Step 3, and that's an important, maybe critical step, is to specify the desired properties that the system should have once it's redesigned. What properties does the system need to have in order to deliver on its missions? You've defined the mission in step 2. Now you want to say, what do I need to have in place so that we can deliver on this mission? And that means essentially, who are we going to serve? Customer, clients, audiences, constituencies. What things are we going to do for them, activities and services? And how are we going to be organized to do it? This is at a high level. These are principles. These are, again, desired properties. So this is not an organizational design, but it's more in terms of the type of organization we should have. For example, here you would say something like a very highly participative organization would be a desired property. Now, there are many different ways of doing that. That would be part of the design itself. Step 4 now is where you create designs and integrate them into composite design. Now, when you have a large group involved, what you often do is create subgroups, and each group would come up with its own design, and then what you have is one or more designs. Sometimes the same group might come up with 2 or 3 different designs. Sometimes it's just one design. So all of those cases, all those scenarios are possible. The bottom line is that if you have more than one design, then you want to integrate them into a composite design that reconciles the different ones. And if you only have one design, that's the design you have. So what you've essentially done is taken all the desired properties and work your way through to a more detailed level of having an actual organizational design. Step 7 then is the key to the planning style. This is to the planning process. This is looking at the design you've come up with, that idealized design, which is what it would ideally look like if we could make it happen, and then see how you can make the closest approximation to that design into a reality today, given the constraints under which you have to operate today. So you look at the gaps between that ideal and where we are, and how far are we? So what are the causes? How are we from the ideal, between the ideal and the current situation? And what may be the causes of the gap? Sometimes they are strictly values, organizational values, culture. Sometimes it's the way we've defined our business in the past, and then a redefinition of the business would change it. Sometimes it's just inertia. That's what we've been doing. That's our history. That's our practices. Sometimes, it's the style, the leadership style of the organization, the knowledge, the skill, whatever it is. What you want is to understand what are the causes of the gaps between the ideal and the current. Because when you understand that, what you will find is that many, well, I shouldn't say necessarily many, but you will find that some and sometimes many of those gaps can readily be addressed, because what causes them are things that are not inherently unchangeable. Sometimes they are self-imposed constraints, things that we think we need to do when in fact we don't have to. And when we look at them, we realize that maybe we don't have to, that we could just change. And then step 8 is to activate a series of steps to implement that design, to make it happen. So what you want is to identify drivers, things that will make it easier to move towards the desired state. And the drivers are things that you're going to try to leverage. You want to identify barriers, the things that are going to slow down or prevent moving towards the desired state. And often these are resistance to change, inertia, structures, existing systems, and some are real, some are self-imposed. So in practice, start with the idealized design and work backwards to identify the changes that needed to make it either feasible or at least make some approximation of it feasible. And then finish with a catalog of action and strategies to move toward the idealized design, knowing that you might not get all the way there, but make progress towards it. I don't think any of you are old enough to have known, in fact, I know you're not, to have known the 60s, but in 1968, Robert Kennedy, who was a candidate for the presidency, was assassinated. And at his funeral, his brother Ted Kennedy, the Senate, who later became senator, or I think he was already senator at the time, in his eulogy said about his brother, he said that most people tend to look at things as they are and ask why, but my brother looked at things that never were and asked why not. And to me, that second part of asking the why not question is the essence of the clean slate idealized design approach. You look at something that does not exist, but that you can think of, and ask why not. And when you ask the question why not, you often find that in fact a lot of it could actually happen. Whereas when you ask the question why, you tend to be grounded into the way things are and maybe not realize the full opportunity of what might be. So that's the essence of this approach. And as you see, it's very different from the traditional, especially the rational planning or the incremental approach, which tend to focus a lot more on what is and the problem-solving part of planning.